What's going on, OGs? Mr. M. I'm trying to finish up these last questions here. We'll see if I can get this thing downloaded and how quickly I can. It might even be too late for you. But whatever, at least I guess I'll have it for the classes in future years. Alright, anyways, let's get to it. So the last video left off with what are the three critical site factors for industrial location. The three site factors that determine where industry locates are land, labor, and capital. Of course, land means land cost. Is there available land? Is it affordable? Does it make more sense to relocate to a new place, to take advantage of cheaper land? Does it make more sense to stay where you're at, even though land values might be more expensive? These are the considerations that a company needs to make. Labor obviously means, do you have available workers? Do you have enough workers? Do you have a large supply of them? That's ideal, right? Because then you have choices, you have options as to who you hire. Also, particular businesses might need certain types of workers, right? Certain industries want low-wage, low-skill workers. Others need higher-wage, high-skill workers in order to produce their products. The third factor, of course, is capital. Capital is another fancy word for money, right? And that does determine where businesses locate because, well, some places generally are easier capital-wise. It's easier for a business to acquire new capital. They might be given breaks, money breaks or tax breaks, tax exemptions where they're not required to pay taxes for a certain amount of years. They might be given land for potentially free, if certain policies are in place. I guess that would go under land, but whatever. So capital is another factor. Maybe that's just friendlier banks, right, and financial institutions, or maybe it's a friendlier government, less environmental restrictions, so less money having to be spent on that by the business. Anyways, which is considered to be the most important? Labor. All right, in modern times, transportation costs have come way down. And so labor now determines primarily where businesses are located. That's why, for instance, you see so much more production in China, Asia, and Latin America, right, because of labor considerations. It also explains movement in the United States and Europe as well. How does land and the cost resources on that land affect industrial location? Well, land is usually cheaper in rural areas. So the closer you are to a city, usually the more expensive the land is because there's more opportunity to do things with it. And so oftentimes in order to afford cheaper land, you need to move out to a more rural area. The problem with that, of course, is you're going to probably have to add transportation costs. Now, if the land's cheap enough, then it pays for the increased transportation costs. So that is a factor. How does land and the cost resources on that land affect industrial location? Yeah, I basically think I just described that right there. So oftentimes in modern times, factories want to be single story. They want to be long and large, so everything gets done on one floor for efficiency, for speed. So oftentimes that means factory locations might be in more rural or suburban places as opposed to urban factories of old. What is a labor-intensive industry? Labor-intensive industry is an industry where a large portion of the costs of production of that product come from paying the workers. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're making a product like a t-shirt. Let's say the cost of making that product is, $10. So it's very small amounts to get the materials needed, and it's produced very quickly, so it doesn't cost you a lot of time. So let's say that a majority of that $10, let's say $6 an hour goes towards paying the worker. All right. Well, that means a majority of the cost of producing that is paying the labor. That means it's a labor-intensive industry. So if a majority of your costs as a business go to paying your workers, then you are a labor-intensive industry. It doesn't matter, usually cheaper products are more labor-intensive, but that's not always the case, all right? For instance, you could have an expensive electronics product, but it's so specialized and difficult to make that you have to pay the worker who does that just huge amounts of money. In that instance, a high-priced product might also be labor-intensive, all right? Anyways, clothing is a great example of a labor-intensive product. That's always the one that I always think of. A lot of food products as well, right? Manufactured food of any type, packaged food generally is labor intensive, right? Because the worker actually gets majority of the cost, or I should say, the majority of the cost of producing it is from paying the worker. Labor-intensive industries are usually the first ones to move to overseas, right? They're the first ones to take advantage of the new International Division of Labor because they can cut their costs the most since labor costs make up a majority of it. So they're the ones that are usually the first to leave or the most likely to leave. Why are they more labor-intensive in LDCs? Well, it has to do with the fact that a lot of cheap products are made overseas. And so even though MDC workers make more money, the products being made in MDCs are so expensive that their wages are not a majority of the cost. Whereas in LDCs, because the products that are being made are so cheap, even though we're paying workers less there, it's still a large majority or a large percentage of the overall cost. What role does capital play in an industrial location? Well, we've kind of already talked about this. Capital usually means more industry arrives. That means it's easier for the business to get loans from banks to get credit, which it needs to continue to expand and to produce more and to build more factories. So places that have a good reputation for free flow of capital, for friendly banks, tend to attract industry. As well, government can contribute, like local city government or county government, even a state can contribute to this by giving tax breaks to businesses, right? So they pay lower percentage of taxes than they otherwise should. Maybe they get other tax incentives where they don't have to pay taxes for a certain number of years. They can, again, not have to maybe worry about spending as much on environmental policies. The city will, for instance, look the other way. The city might provide them, with free water or free electricity. All of these are capital moves designed to attract industry, right? It has nothing to do with the land itself. It has nothing to do with the labor. These are decisions to help that business to have more capital, which it desperately needs in order to continue to grow. Give an example of multiple industries that have located in a particular area, partly because of high finance capital in the area. Oh gosh, okay. Silicon Valley, tech firms, computer firms, information firms have clustered there. Los Angeles, we've seen high-end fashion firms cluster there. We've also seen Hollywood movies cluster there, partly because, again, of friendly capital flow in both places. In Silicon Valley, it was banks, right? In Los Angeles, it's not just banks, but it's also just investors who are willing to invest a lot of money in these industries. Other examples, the Research Triangle in the South, in North and South Carolina and Tennessee, which of course is associated with free flow of capital. We've actually seen a number of banks relocate there, large banks, and then they start to loan pretty freely in the new location in order to encourage other industries to locate there too. And of course, in the Northeast, right, we have some college campuses up there that have supported the agglomeration of businesses, of industries in one area. Although that's usually because of research institutions, not necessarily because of the banks being so friendly there. New York City has a reputation for friendly banks as well, so they've attracted a lot of industries throughout the years. How has the distribution of industry... and by the way, I should mention one other. Singapore and Hong Kong and Tokyo, these Asian cities, they have a really strong reputation for free flow of capital as well. And so that is a reason why more wealthy corporations and businesses that do work for wealthier people will oftentimes cluster in those cities in Asia. Okay, what role does how has the distribution of industry shifted in the United States in modern times thanks to site factors? Land costs are cheaper in the South, so it has contributed to the movement of industry to the South. Southern states are much cheaper, they're more rural, and property taxes are not as high, and so therefore land values are not as high. And so that has led businesses to relocate because it's cheaper land there, so they can sell high in their old state and buy cheap and save a lot of money. Labor, obviously labor is the big one in the South, right? Because, for instance, much cheaper there, so it has led to industries relocating to the Sun Belt, right, to take advantage of lower labor costs. Capital, less common in modern times, but again, we do have some exceptions with those technopoles, especially Silicon Valley. What are right-to-work laws? How have they influenced this shift? Remember, right-to-work laws basically say any worker can get hired by an industry at any wage. Of course, it doesn't require you to be a member of a union. It makes it harder for unions to form. All of this generally protects business and kind of keeps workers more dependent on the business instead of on the union. And so as a result, businesses have clustered in these areas to take advantage of these right-to-work laws to better compete with their rivals overseas. What other factors have also influenced this changing distribution? I mentioned some of this today. The development of infrastructure like roads and railroads throughout the country, as opposed to just in the north and in the east, helped. Weather, all right, and developments like refrigeration and air conditioning have clearly helped as well. How has the distribution of industry shifted in Europe in modern times? It's almost a reverse on the map of the United States. If the U.S. has gone from the north and the east to the Sun Belt, to the south and the west, Europe has started in Britain and Northern Europe, and it has moved now to south and east towards the lower wage areas of Europe. Those are called convergence regions or convergence zones by the EU, and remember, the EU actively encourages businesses to relocate there. Of course, the areas that are losing these valuable factories and manufacturers are called competitive and employment regions, and they are also compensated by the EU for their losses in order to hopefully maybe attract a new business, develop new businesses based on new innovations, or maybe retrain or re-educate workers so they can take on different tasks in society since their old factory has relocated either south or east. Of course, remember, a big difference here is that European countries and the EU really kind of, I don't want to say like forces this to happen, but they kind of oversee and coordinate this movement to try to make it smoother and to try to make sure that we're raising development in some of these places in Southern and Eastern Europe, while hopefully not dragging development down in the places that are losing the manufacturing. What areas of Europe has industry grown the most in modern times? I've already mentioned generally Southern and Eastern Europe, but remember Spain, right, has experienced a boom. Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic have definitely experienced a boom as well. What areas outside of the United States are gaining the most industry because of their cheap labor sources? We talked about this in class today. It's East Asia, spearheaded by China. I would argue it's also Southeast Asia, which would include Vietnam and other countries there. And then we have South Asia, led by India. And our third primary area that has gained the most since the 70s because of cheap labor sources is Latin America. How do steel and textiles demonstrate the shift? Both of them used to be produced almost entirely in the U.S. and Europe. Now a majority are produced overseas in other locations. What is outsourcing? What is the new division of labor in modern times? Outsourcing is when a business sends part of their production process overseas to a smaller factory in order to cut costs, because it's cheaper than producing it in the United States. Usually outsourcing involves the cheapest of products that require the lowest of skills so that workers can be paid the lowest possible amount to save the big business the money it needs when it sells the product. What's the new division of labor? This is the international division of labor. This is the idea that businesses now completely analyze every part of their production process, and in order to cut costs, they will send low-skill jobs to overseas locations. The higher skill, higher education requirement jobs stay in the MDC. What is the footloose industry? Footloose industries are industries that aren't really dependent on site and situation factors, and so they're really able to locate wherever they'd want. Usually, footloose industries are things that don't require like rapid delivery to the market. So for instance, they're usually associated with services, but let me give you some examples of footloose industries. So the one we always like to use is like English speaking, like services, like when businesses have customer service needs. They will oftentimes hire workers overseas who can speak English. They can pay those workers a lot less. and then they can just kind of jump around and move those workers to other English-speaking countries without really having to invest a lot or adhere to a lot of cost. So Footloose just basically means the business isn't tied to a particular location. Site and situation costs seem to be less effective or less important to these sorts of industries. They're more able to move around to take advantage of location factors that are important to them. And again, usually we associate it with services, not industries, because services are easier to up and move to a new location. What is the Fordist and post-Fordist method? Remember, Fordist is the assembly line method. It's mass production by having one worker focus on one task in the process. Kind of boring, kind of tedious, kind of monotonous, but really efficient. Post-Fordism is more of a Japanese model, and remember, it's team-based, it's collaborative. The idea is you work together to come up with methods to produce and solve to produce for your company and solve potential problems more efficiently, more effectively, based on equality and all voices being heard. What are the differences? I just kind of described them. What are the factors that cause certain industries to prefer high-skilled workers? By the way, Fordist method is popular in LDCs. I should say it's popular with low-cost, low-skill work forces. Post-Fordism is more popular with high-tech, high-skill workforces. So generally, you'll see Fordism more in LDCs these days, and you'll see the post-Fordist model being adopted more in MDCs. What are the factors that have caused certain industries to prefer high-skilled workers? If you work in tech or information, if you're in research or development, if you're in science, especially like scientific research, all of those generally require very specifically skilled, trained workers. And so those must stay more local to the MDC, and particularly in cities, so that they can take advantage of large, usually college-educated workforces. What is just-in-time delivery? It's a new method of delivery that's become popular in modern times. No longer do businesses want to store their warehouses and buildings with boxes until they need to use a product. They want their spaces open. They want their facilities smaller and leaner. And so therefore they expect delivery or shipment of products that they need right away. When they need it in a few hours. And so they expect factories that are working with them or shippers to deliver products right away. This usually means that small factories that are working with a single market manufacturer must sometimes still locate close to the big factory. So this is another reason why you might not see all factories locate overseas, because sometimes certain factories still have to be located next to the big mother one in order to provide that just-in-time delivery. So it keeps some facilities, some factories, some industry located in core countries. What's a special economic zone and export processing zone, and gives examples of how they're used to encourage corporations to relocate. Okay, SEZs are in Mexico and other places, but Mexico's is the most famous. EPZs, SEZs are in China and Asia. They are spread all throughout the Asian countries, and they were revolutionized by Asian countries who came up with them. China is the most famous. EPZs, export processing zones, are the ones that are located in Mexico. An SEZ is a port area. It's an area along the coast in many Asian countries where foreign businesses, corporations, are allowed to set up factories. The factories are allowed to hire local workers. That's what attracts the factory to the new place. Also, since they're located right on the port, it's easy for them to get their products shipped out of the country, so they can export them to the consumers in MDC markets. The one thing that SEZs do not allow a business to do, and this is why China and other countries love them, is even though foreign businesses are allowed to set up in an SEZ in China, they're not allowed to sell those products there. All products have to be shipped out of the country. So China gets the benefit of these corporations' tax money. They get the benefit of these corporations hiring their workers, but they don't have to worry about these corporations selling products that are superior to the Chinese products, which makes it more likely that the Chinese products are still going to be bought there. So again, it's one of the things that's really attracted foreign businesses. They can take advantage of those low-cost workers and still get their products back to the MDCs in order to sell them. EPZ was created as part of NAFTA. It's located in other places as well in Europe. It's a zone right along our border between the United States and Mexico, where American factories are allowed to set up. Those factories are known as maquiladoras. These maquiladoras are American factories. They're assembly factories. So they don't really make products. What they do is they get products or pieces or parts that have been made in Southeast Asia and China, and also India, and then they assemble these products together at the maquiladoras in Mexico, right on the border. The workers here get paid obviously higher wages than the workers in Asia do. And the work here is a little bit more difficult. And since now all the parts have been made and all that's left to do is assembly for many of these products, by doing it in Mexico, it's much closer to the market, which speeds up the process by which it gets to the market. Again, with an EPZ, the American companies producing products that will be sold in the United States, but they're being produced by Mexican workers who are technically being paid lower than American equivalent, but obviously still a little bit higher than Asian workers who have lower skill would be able to, or would be receiving. And so many corporations, American ones, instead of relocating from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, some have just said, well, screw it, let's just move to Mexico and these maquiladora areas instead. By the way, remember when we looked at the map of Mexico and it showed all the development along the border region? Well, now you know why. Those maquiladoras are pumping development money into the development counties or provinces or states right along the border with the United States. What's a maquiladora? I just mentioned it's one of these new factories, these assembly plants or factories that hire Mexican workers. A lot of Mexican women get hired in these as well, which is a boost to their economic means. How do they reflect the new International Division of Labor? I think I just kind of explained it. They're a perfect example of how you can produce some products in very low wage places like Central America or Southeast Asia, and then you can actually ship it closer to your home country into a maquiladora in order to assemble it so that it can be sold at market almost immediately by shipping it right across the border without restrictions. Anyways, folks, hope it helps. That's Mr. M. I'm signing off. I hope this gives you some time to learn this. I hope this helps you. I'm sorry, I can barely speak. It's late. All right, bye.